Good morning. You'll probably notice I'm traveling one light this morning. Linda is still at home and sounds like she's breathing through cotton candy or something like that. She has complete chest congestion. She's really kind of an ugly cold that won't go away. And unfortunately, I caught that same cold on Monday and have been sick all week and still woke up this morning with not as bad as her, fortunately, and for some reason my voice still works, chest congestion and all those things. So number one, I will not be in the back of the church after the service. I'd rather recommend the other elders do that. And in other words, don't touch me this morning is what I would say for your sake. I don't want to infect anyone. So just to let you know, don't shake my hands. It's nothing personal today, but today you don't want to touch me. I feel like I should be walking around the church with a little bell around my neck, ringing it, saying unclean, unclean. But again, I didn't want to miss today, but I also don't want to infect anyone. If I go into a coughing fit, which may happen, just be patient. I'll drink some water. I've been lightheaded a couple of times from it, so if I faint, the elders know to come back up here, pick me up, and I'll start preaching again. If I do both, I'll probably run for president, but that's another story. Point being is that I didn't want to miss this morning, but I do want to warn you, don't touch me. I am serious about that. These verses here that we're looking at are confusing verses if you look at them and don't pay attention to what's going on. These verses are verses where you have to look at the context. And when we look at the context, we can take a lot out of it. And in truth, a lot of the questions that are being asked are actually questions that parallel to what we're going to see people asking today. One of the things in the context we have to remember is that these were written, remember, Chapter 1, starting in verse 18, was talking about the failed way of Gentiles trying to reach salvation, the failed way of Gentiles getting to God, and just the utter sinfulness the Gentiles were falling into. As we started in chapter 2, we saw Paul started talking about the Jews and how they tried to use religion to get to God, but they forgot about God. They weren't looking for the Messiah. They weren't looking for what really was true. Instead, they were going through legalism, and they wanted a legalistic way to work their way to God. And what the conclusion there is that as legalistic Jews, you guys are no better than the Gentiles are. You're both in the same boat here. So the first thing for context we got to see is legalistic Jews didn't work, Gentile way didn't work, and that because of that, and not just because of that, because of who God is, there is no favoritism with God. God doesn't care if you're a Jew or a Gentile or anything else. God has His own standards, and it doesn't make any difference. Nobody has a leg up inherently. And the question that kept coming out of that in this day, and frankly we have today also, is God fair? Is it fair for God to do this and act this way? And in response to this, Paul answers three major questions in these verses. Actually, a fourth question we dealt with last week, but here we're going to see three major questions that Paul deals with. Now, the first question we see in verses 3 and 4. Verse 3 says, "What then, if some did not believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it?" First question you've got to ask here, which is a small one, but if you don't get it, you're going to miss the point. When it says, if some did not believe, who is some? Who's he talking about here? In this case, he's not talking about everybody in the world. When he says some in this case, with the context, we can see that's actually Jews who have turned to religion but who are not following God. These were people who were knowledgeable in God. And because of that, it makes it even worse because they had knowledge of the law. They knew what the law was. They knew exactly what it was. But instead, they chose to follow their own legalistic methods instead of following what God really wanted. Now, the first question that comes up about this is, did God still provide? Is this God's fault? Is God fair? The fact is, if we look at Jewish history, we can see they had the truth. God still provided the truth. It was their choice to reject that truth. And the funny thing is, of the chosen people, most of the chosen people ended up in hell because they turned and over and over we see in the history of Israel. And I'm not blaming them. Frankly, any group of people would have probably done the same thing. But what happened? They turn away. God has to take them into captivity. Then they say, "Oh God, please help us," and they bring them back. Happens over and over and over again in their history. Why do they keep falling away when they've got it all sitting there right there in front of them? They knew the truth. In their temple, they had the Ark of the Covenant. They couldn't go see it, obviously, because the Holy of Holies is a little problem. You walk in there, you die. Other than that, it's fine. But the point is, they couldn't go see these things, but they had this. They knew it. They knew about the parting of the Red Sea. They knew all these things, and yet they still kept turning their back on God. Which brings up the question is it God's fault that they rejected that gift? Some of you may or may not have heard of him, but there's a man named Theodore Geisel. Theodore Geisel took his books and submitted his first book to 27 different publishers. Not only did they reject his book, but several of them actually wrote back and told him that his book was pure rubbish. They really didn't like his books at all. Now, you may know Theodore Geisel better by the name he wrote under, which is Dr. Seuss, who became one of the most famous authors in history. The fact is, these publishers had a gold mine sitting in their hands, and they rejected it. They walked away from it. They didn't want it. No, it's rubbish. We don't want that. Very similar to what happened with the Jews rejecting God. However, in that case, at least you could say, well, they would have had to put some money forward to take advantage of this. Well, that's true, but then there's also probably the most famous business screw-up in history, possibly, certainly one of the biggest screw-ups. Because there was a movie that was being made back, I believe, early 80s, if I remember correctly. And they went to the Mars company who made M&Ms. Now, normally if you watch TV today or you watch movies today, everywhere you look, there's Coke cans, there's Pepsi cans, there's this and that. It's called product placement. They're paying to get their product on the air normally just to have you see it, okay? This movie company didn't want a product placement fee. They just said, we want to use M&Ms in our movie. And nobody at Mars would ever approve it, and they turned them down. Said, nope, don't want that. Because of that, E.T. ended up following Reese's Pieces. Had it not been for that, the original script, he followed M&Ms. It was one of the biggest gifts in history to the Mars company. And yet in one of the biggest screw-ups ever, they said, nope, you can't put M&Ms in your movie. And it wasn't even going to cost them a dime. It was free. Was that the movie producer's fault? No. It was Mars's fault. They rejected the gift. The gift was right there. It wasn't the producer's fault. If we look at God and the Jews, same thing. God gave them everything they needed, and they walked away. It was never God's fault. But here's the objection. Think about it. Not only was Paul facing this objection, we face this objection maybe not every day, but you've heard it before. Is God really fair? Is it fair that God did this? Well, yes, it's fair. God gave out the gospel. God paid for our sins through Christ, through His blood. It's not God's fault when we reject God's gift. Same thing here. Paul's saying, look, the unbelieving Jews, it wasn't God's fault. It was their own fault. And you can't blame the giver because the gift was rejected. Now, one of the questions you might want to ask also is, why is Paul even asking this question? Okay? And again, it comes back to God being fair. But I would say in our day today, why do we even pay attention to this question? Have you run into people that first thing they want to ask you, present the gospel to them, and the first thing they want to do is, yeah, but what about predestination or free will? Usually they've studied the Bible a little bit, and yeah, but God predestined everyone, and we don't have any choice, and therefore, on and on and on. Same kind of question to impugn God's character. Because no matter what the answer is on predestination and free will, it's not God who is at fault. I can tell you this, no matter what you believe about that topic, God never predestined people to sin. He does not predestine every little thing that we do. He knows what we're going to do. He is all knowledgeable. But by the same token, He didn't say you're going to sin, because if He did, that would literally make God the author of sin. We're allowed to choose our actions, but God knows what those choices will be, but He doesn't force us to choose those actions. The reason we take those actions is because it's in our nature to take those actions in many cases. But He's not forcing us, because if He was forcing us, you know something? The people would have a legitimate argument. God made me sin. Why should you blame me for it? God never has made anyone sin. It's our choice. And again, the reason this is coming up in Paul's day is I think you really had people who were just trying to throw little monkey wrenches in the gospel. And that's really what was happening here. These three questions, Paul was getting these questions. And that's why he's answering them. Now we also see in verse 4 says, may it never be. When you see that phrase there, you're going to see it comes up multiple times in this chapter. It also comes up in Romans 6 and other places. That's really a very soft way of translating it. I would translate that as, no way, are you kidding me? It's really a very emotional way to say things that Paul's doing in the original. And he's just saying, are you kidding? Have you lost your mind? Just think of the word, no way. That's what Paul's saying. Is it God's fault? No, of course not. But then it says, rather let God be found true, though every man be found a liar. As it is written, thou mightest be justified in thy words, and mightest prevail when thou art judged. So the first question coming down here is God a liar? And one of the questions for that is because people legitimately could say, well, if God's a liar, we really don't have to listen to what he says. Again, it's all obstacles people are trying to throw up. And what Paul is saying is, no, of course not. One of the things, think about this. Have you ever I've actually run into people like this. You know, whether they're smoking crack or whether they're not doing what they should or whatever, okay? And they're sitting around and they're saying, I just can't get a job. It's the employer's fault. Everybody's against me because I can't get a job. You know something? If you're smoking crack 3 times a day, it's not the employer's fault you can't get a job. And that's pretty obvious, okay? And I'm taking an extreme example here, okay? But the fact is that some people are bringing it on themselves. I don't mean everybody. People have legitimate problems, but some people are bringing it on themselves. And in this case, here's what he's saying also is, God's not the one that created this problem. You're sinners. But in addition to that also, everyone is responsible for our own sin and our own faults. We want to scapegoat somebody when we sin. And let's face it, we have that often, if you know what I'm saying. I remember sticking my neck. One of the things I used to do is, I used to work for other networking companies as well and hiring people for them. They figured if you want to hire a senior network engineer, you get a senior network engineer to ask the questions. And it was a good thought. One of the things I remember is a guy that I stuck my neck out for. I said, you know something, this guy is not a senior network engineer, but he'd make a darn good network administrator. Hire the guy. And not only that, there's just something about him, he's really going to make it. They hired the guy. First day for work, he showed up at 11:30 in the morning. When asked about it, he basically said, well, I got tied up and I didn't know the traffic was the way it was and everything else. Not a good excuse, but okay. Noon came and he said, I got to go to lunch. I'm going out with my friends today. He came back at 2:30 in the afternoon. About 4:30, he decided he'd worked enough for that day. After all, where's a man out working 3 or 4 solid hours in a day? On top of that, it took about 3 days. We didn't even know this, but the client at their site had video recording set up in the server room. It was about the second day that he was there when he walked into a side closet and started taking all the digital cameras and loading them into the pockets of his coat and walking out the door with them. I stuck my neck out for this guy, and the fact is that I was relying on him being truthful and being faithful. And the truth is, he's the one that threw his own opportunity away. The fact is, we want to blame somebody when something goes wrong. And in this case, spiritually, what do we want to do? We want to say, nope, God, you're at fault. You're the reason I did this. You're the reason I sinned. You're the reason I lied. Yeah, it strikes home with me also when it says, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar. One thing I remember was a church I went to many years ago. I've talked about this church before, where I found out that the pastor of the church was a complete fraud. Every degree he had, everything about him was a complete fake life. One of the things I remember is after he left, an incident came up and people were talking about what happened, and I stood up and I said, that's not what happened. I said, I remember what happened in this incident, and I'm telling you this is exactly what happened. Well, pretty soon, one person stood up, another person stood up. By the time it was done, 50 people stood up in that room and said I was lying. Said that I was not telling the truth. 2 weeks later, even though they still thought I was lying, the person admitted that there was a tape of the entire incident, which I knew there was, and that exactly what I said was true, even though 50 people stood up and said I was a liar. And all 50 of those people were either lying or deceived. I don't know which. But the tape proved that word for word what I said was true. The fact is, even though that didn't feel good, and obviously I'm not God and make no claims to be God, what we're looking at is the fact that just because you have a large group of people saying something isn't true doesn't make it not true. And if God's saying it, that majority of one is enough. God doesn't need a quorum of people to make sure that He's telling the truth. He doesn't need to stand before a bunch of judges who are going to say yes or no on how He did. God's never been taken to the Supreme Court. We can argue over things. God Himself has never been taken there and never will be. It doesn't work that way. He is a majority of one, and no evidence outweighs God's word. Now, when we look at the verse that's quoted here, it's interesting, where it says, that thou might be justified in thy words, and might prevail when thou art judged. It actually comes from Psalm 51:4. What's interesting about it, this was David speaking these words, saying, God, no matter what somebody might have done, no matter what people think, you're the one that's righteous, not us. What's interesting is the context of what this psalm talked about. This psalm was when Nathan came to David and said, David, you're wrong. stood against the king. And what he was wrong about is he confronted him about Bathsheba. He confronted him about the death of Uriah. David was a murderer and adulterer. And finally, even though he did wrong, instead of saying, I'm going to look for another way around this, he said, you're right. God is just. I am not. That's the context he's talking about. The fact is that God is always true. Now, one of the things, I don't know if you thought about this or not, is that I believe that truth is an attribute of God. Not always listed with the attributes of God. But one of the reasons I say this is because we know God is holy, and it is impossible for someone to be holy and be a liar at the same time. God has to be true always in order to be holy. If he's not true, he's not holy. So that's how important truth is here, is that truth is an absolute attribute of God. And again, back in these verses, what's being slandered? God's being slandered by these people who are saying either God never provided a way or God's not truthful. Neither one of those are true. They're slanders against God. We come to the second question in verses 5 through 7. And verse 5 said, but if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That the God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he? I'm speaking in human terms. This is a not only difficult verse for me to read this morning, obviously, but this is a confusing verse. Because you look at it and go, what's he talking about? Why our unrighteousness demonstrate the righteousness of God? What's he talking about? Remember the context. The context is Jewish people who are trying to get to God through their own righteousness, and ultimately there is no favoritism with God. What was the result of the Jews rejecting God? I'm actually happy they did. Gentile salvation. Salvation went to the entire world because the Jews rejected God. So the point being is, I think what he's saying here is that if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, the unrighteous rejection of the Jewish people is what demonstrated God's salvation to the entire world. That's what it brought about. So therefore, he's not just talking something generically. What he's saying is, this specifically brought about Gentile salvation. When he says also, if our unrighteousness, again, remember, he's speaking to the Jews specifically who are trying to bring in legalism. That's the group he was talking about. You have to look at the text to see what it's really saying. Now, the next question that comes up here, which is important, is it says, the God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous. One of the things we have a misunderstanding about today on our society, and it's not from the Bible, but it's from our society, is that God doesn't inflict wrath. Let me say this. God absolutely inflicts wrath. And when the end judgment comes, anyone who does not believe in Christ and is saved by the blood of Christ will have wrath inflicted upon them. God does not inflict wrath on his children. But God does inflict wrath. Now, that's not a very PC thing to say nowadays, and it's not a very popular thing to say. Oh, they're a good person, but they're still going to suffer the wrath of God. You're right, that's not very nice, and that's not very politically correct. But it's in the Bible, all through the Bible. God is a God who inflicts wrath. One of the things I don't know if you've ever heard of or not, in 2008 there was a document created. And the document is commonly known as the Yale document. Originally there was a group of Muslim scholars who wrote an open letter to Christian scholars in the U.S. saying, why can't we all be friends, basically? I'm paraphrasing here. The response is interesting because the response was signed by many, many people, including Rick Warren of Saddleback Church, which I think was probably the least wise thing he has ever done. Another signature is Brian McLaren, who is right over here in Silver Spring. If you would ever like to go hear heresy, go for it. Absolute heresy, period. If he's saved, he hides it well. And basically a complete universalism. A rejection of Jesus Christ, in my opinion. I would not say that about Rick Warren, but certainly about McLaren. These are the kind of guys that signed it. But here's what this document said. This document, and let me say this also, I have nothing at all, I have no problems with us being friends with Muslim people, okay? I have no problem with us being at peace with Muslims in our neighborhood. But we don't worship the same God. And not only did this document hide this, but this document basically came out and said the basis for everything is love. And that's what brings about peace. And this document that these pastors wrote used 1 John 4 several times. That was the basis of the document, essentially, saying that because God is love, we all really worship the same God, even if we don't know it. They didn't use that term, but we all worship the same God. And we should be able to be at peace with each other because God is love. The entire basis is the phrase, God is love. The problem with that, and we've talked about this before, that phrase only occurs twice in the New Testament, in the entire Bible. And both times in 1 John 4, and both times the context makes it clear it's not talking about the basic attribute of God. God is a loving God. But when you start with the fact of God is love, you exclude holiness. Because if God is only love, He can't take out wrath on people and He can't be just. However, a holy God can show love and can show mercy. And the problem is when you start with God is love and that trumps everything, that is politically correct. But it's not the Bible. You want to find out what the Bible says about God, hundreds and hundreds of times you see God is holy. That's what the Bible says about God. He is a loving God, but first He's holy. And if we don't keep that in mind, it all gets messed up, and then suddenly, well, yeah, how could God condemn other sincere religious people? Shouldn't we all just... Because if you base it on God as love, that's going to be the conclusion. God as love is a tiny portion of the picture. And I don't mean to please, I'm not minimizing love here. What I'm saying is start with the basics, which the Bible talks about. God is holy. And as holiness, you'll find in order to be holy, He has to be just, He has to be true, He has to be righteous. All of those come out of holiness. And He's a loving God because He chooses to show love to His people. The next thing in this passage, this next phrase, and I hate to keep picking it apart phrase by phrase, but we have to here, where it says, I am speaking in human terms. Brings up a lot of confusion because the first thing people say is, aha, see, it's not inspired. I told you the Bible's not inspired. That's not what it's talking about at all. What he's saying here is, in human terms, what he's saying is, according to the wisdom of men. That's a good way to put it. Basically saying men ask foolish questions. Humans ask foolish questions. I don't want to leave anybody out here. But we do too as men. The point is, men ask foolish questions. And these foolish questions are, is God righteous? Isn't it God's fault because we didn't accept the gift? Isn't it God's fault because we couldn't tell it was true? It's just a whole list here of why it's God's fault. So when he's saying, I'm speaking in human terms, what he's saying is, there are going to be a bunch of idiots out there, and there already are, who's saying, isn't it God's fault? That's all it means. It does not mean the Bible is uninspired in any way. Now, in addition to that, we also see that it says, the God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is He? So the question they're being asking is, the question we have today, too. Isn't God an unrighteous God because He inflicts wrath? Have you ever been asked the question, which always starts with, if God is real, how could He fill in the blank, and the blank usually is allow suffering, allow pain, allow, you name it. How could He send someone to hell? The fact is, it's because God is righteous, God will do that and allow that. The fact is that if we're honest about it, we all deserve hell. The miracle is that God saves anyone, that God shows any mercy. It's not God's fault when people sin. What we're really looking for, let's face it, we're looking for an excuse to sin. We're looking for an excuse to say, it's not me. I don't know, if you've lived in this area, you saw it, and it's burned into our memory. I'm not going to complete the entire statement for obvious reasons. But you remember when Marion Barry got caught on tape and arrested? Remember the one phrase, set me up? Yeah. Was he set up? Well, yeah, maybe it was a sting, but the fact is, he's the one that chose to smoke crack. It wasn't the person sitting next to him. And I don't mean to pick on Marion Barry here. It's just such a beautiful example. The fact is, we all do the same thing. I've done it. I'm sure you guys have too. No, it wasn't really me. It was because, fill in the blank here. We choose to sin. We are sinners. That happens. But the fact is, does that make God, what the person is saying here, that makes God unrighteous? No, it doesn't. Again, because suffering exists in the world, God can't be righteous. That's exactly what this question is coming to the heart of. The fact is, God is righteous, God is holy, and it's because of that holiness that there is pain in the world, because we bring it on ourselves through sin. If we continue on to verse 6, it say, may it never be. Again, no way. I should have included that in verse 5. That's his answer to, is God unrighteous? No way. Are you kidding me? And it goes on. For otherwise, how will God judge the world? Now, why is he saying, if God's unrighteous, how will he judge the world? What's he talking about? I will never forget, years ago, going to a court case and watching. Linda had gotten a traffic ticket. And it was not only a bogus traffic ticket, but let me say this, it could be proven easily that what he claimed she did could not have happened. There were physical reasons why you could see it couldn't have possibly happened on the road he said it happened on. I don't know why the police officer wrote the ticket. I don't know what happened. I wasn't with Linda when it happened. But I was able to measure out things and compute things and figure out this is physically, if physics exists, then this didn't happen, no matter what the officer says. Now here's the thing that was interesting. When she went to court, the officer was rather smug about it, and frankly rather snarky about it, and I thought that was wrong. But what was really interesting wasn't the officer, it was the judge. Because when Linda started to talk, the judge interrupted her, the judge mocked her, Prince George's County District Court. The judge was mocking her, interrupting her, not allowing to present her case. The judge became an advocate for the prosecution. That is an unrighteous judge. An unrighteous judge is not judging fairly. Instead, that judge, she had her mind made up before it ever started. It was obvious. And to watch that was frustrating. And nothing you could do. And she found him guilty. The fact is that if we start looking at this, it's the same thing people are saying about God. They're saying God's not a righteous judge. I think God is a righteous judge, and so did Paul. Is God unrighteous? No way. And then the question is, what would the result be if God was unrighteous? The answer is, God could not possibly be a fair judge. An unrighteous person, now not to say, obviously in human terms, we appoint people hopefully that have as best character as we can. But when you're talking about God who judges the planet, if God is not just, if God is not holy, if God is not righteous, then his judgments will not be righteous. And Paul's saying, no way, that's just not the way it is. The other thing too, I don't know if you ever thought about it or not, but when we talk about an unjust judge, whether he can judge the world or not, and God being righteous, if God is not holy, if God himself is not holy, there is absolutely no basis for right and wrong in the world or anywhere else. Now, why would I say that? When we look at the Bible does not make things right and wrong. I've said that to people before and I go, what? You're disparaging the Bible. No, I'm not. It's not the Bible that makes things right or wrong. The Bible's telling us what's right and wrong. God himself determines what's right and wrong. You know, so if God had never written the Bible, it would still be wrong to steal and murder and all kinds of other things I could mention here. When Cain killed Abel, do you think God said, didn't you see in Ezekiel say, or whatever, No, of course not. There was no Bible when Cain killed Abel. It was wrong. And why? Because the basis for right and wrong is the character and nature of God. That's what makes things right and wrong. If God were not righteous and were not holy, we would have no basis for right and wrong whatsoever. It's absolutely essential that God be holy in order for all of this to hold together. If God's not holy, I may as well take this, set fire to it, and use it for kindling. Because that's what it comes down to. If God's not holy and sinless, the Bible's meaningless. And it's the absolute basis for all right and wrong. If we continue on to verse 7, it says, but if through my lie the truth of God abounded to his glory, why am also I still being judged a sinner? Another confusing verse, but when we look at it closer, it's going to make sense. What he's saying is that if I'm lying, but God's actually being glorified, because look, all these Gentiles are being saved, then why do you call me a sinner? How can you call me a sinner if it's worked out so good? We have a tendency to do that sometimes in our own culture, if you think about it. The fact is that it doesn't make something right just because a good outcome happened. And the thing we have to look back at is in verse 6, is that verse 6 is talking about an unrighteous judge. What he's really saying is, if God's not a righteous judge, why would you hold me to the standard you don't even hold God to? It's necessary for God to be righteous for him to demand righteousness from his people, to demand holiness. If we go on to verse 8, we start seeing question number 3. we see it says, and why not say, as some are slanderously reported, and as some affirm that we say, let us do evil that good may come. Their condemnation is just. Again, you have to look at the context and look at this a phrase at a time to see what's happening. Remember we said a minute ago about right and wrong, the outcome doesn't determine whether something's right and wrong. Take a look at the Bible, and what you're going to see, for example, is Joseph when he was sold into slavery. His brothers got together, they were going to kill him. They said, and I love it, the one brother's like, he's the good guy. No, why would we kill him? We can turn a profit on this guy. Sold him into slavery to the Egyptians. Actually, I believe the Midianites, and then they sent him to Egypt. Point being is that the actions of Joseph's brothers, you could legitimately say, saved the world pretty much. Took care of the famines, gave power to the pharaohs, did everything you would want to happen here. Did that make their actions right? No. They were still wrong to sell their brother into slavery. I don't know about you guys, but to me, it's pretty clear. Sell your brother into slavery, that crosses a line you just shouldn't cross. Their actions were not right because the outcome was good. The outcome was wonderful. The outcome elevated Joseph to probably the second most powerful person in the entire world. People don't think about that. Egypt was the place to be back in that point in time. The Pharaoh was the most powerful person in the world, and the Pharaoh said, Joseph, you're in charge of everything. Take care of the business here. Second most powerful man in the world accomplished this through sinful actions. Didn't make it right. And frankly, we even do this sometimes with Bible verses. I still remember in Child Evangelism Fellowship, not that I'm criticizing them, but you had G-O-S-P-E-L, God is love, and I forget now. It goes through the whole gospel, spells it out. And the last one is L, for let him in. And the verse, Revelation 3:20, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him and he with me. Isn't that wonderful? If we just let Jesus into our heart, we're saved. The problem is that's not what that verse is talking about at all. Not even close to what that verse is talking about. It's talking about people who are already in the Laodicean church who would harden to God to open up their hearts to God. It's not talking about going out for conversions. Now the reason it was important was I remember when several of us confronted one of the CEF leaders about this and said, shouldn't we be using a different verse? Because don't you realize, the response was interesting. The response was, yeah, well, we know it really doesn't say that, but it's such a good verse. No, it's not a good verse if it doesn't mean what you say it means. Actually, it's a good verse, but just not for what you're saying. The point is that they were taking something which was a good verse and misusing it deliberately, not mistakenly, to accomplish something, essentially setting up a lie to bring people into the heaven of God, into heaven. Now, the results may have been good, but that doesn't justify what they did. And it may seem like a small thing, but truth is important. And this is a case where they just said it's not that important. But again, a good outcome never makes something right. Now, if we continue in verse 8, we see it says, let us do evil that good may come. Why does he talk about that here? Number, we've already brought that up. It's because the Jews turning from God brought about Gentile salvation. But he also talks in that verse about slanderously reported. What we know from this is there were people going around making false accusations against Paul. One of them that may have been part of this is what we call antinomianism, meaning that Paul was actually saying, hey, it's a gospel of grace. And actually one of the things Paul had to deal with in verse 6 of Romans is people that were actually saying, look, the more you sin, the better the glory is to God. Because after all, that'll just show he's even more magnanimous. We know that's not true. But there were a lot of slanderous accusations going on about Paul. Not only that, it says, let us do evil that good may come. We see one of the most horrifying examples of this ever in our culture when we see radical Islamic terrorists who are blowing people up and killing people in the name of God. What they're saying is they're bringing about, and obviously we don't believe what they believe anyway, but they're bringing about God's work by murdering and slaughtering. I'm sorry, I don't think that's what God wants. And obviously it's a different God than we're talking about. But again, I use that extreme example, but it's not uncommon to find people saying, well, it's okay to do this even though it's wrong because it makes things better. Sometimes, and I don't mean, sometimes white lies come into that category. Now, if somebody says to you they've got you're holding a surprise birthday party, I don't think it's a sin to tell them no it's not and try to get them there for the surprise. I don't mean things like that, okay? But a lot of times we let things go in our lives or the lives of others that we just, they're things we really need to deal with. And instead it's easier to just give a little bit of a lie because after all, who does it hurt? That's kind of what he's talking about here, just in a little tiny way. Doing evil does not bring about good. And that's what Paul was dealing with. And the last phrase here, when Paul says their condemnation is just, does not mean that they were fair to criticize Paul. What he's saying is, hypothetically, if what these people were saying was true, then the condemnation would be just. Then I would be preaching a false gospel. Then I would be leading people away from God. But again, remember, all of these questions fall into the category of not my fault, God's fault. All of these questions are human objections. That's what we're dealing with here. That's what Paul was dealing with. When we get to verse 9, it asks then, what then? Are we better off than they? Who are they? They are the Gentiles. Are the Jews better off than the Gentiles? Not at all, for we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. What he's trying to say here, and these verses are not meant to elevate the Gentiles, what these verses are meant to say is the Jews of that day, the religious Jews, are in the same boat as the Gentiles. And that boat is every one of us is equal before God. Two parts. We're equal before God and we're all under sin. The equal before God, you know something? We see this a lot in our culture. Wealthy people sometimes get treated better than poor people. Beautiful people. I mean, let's face it. When you were in school, didn't you have the girl or the guy that just looked like they came right out of a commercial or something? And just things seem to fall in place because people, and it's not always, it's just, people naturally do that sometimes. You know something? God doesn't care. Hey, if you want, one of the things I've seen is if you deposit $250,000 into a Chase bank account, they will give you what they call private banking, where they take care of you and do a bunch of things. And even worse than that, there's something, I shouldn't say worse, more than that, there's something that's called an American Express Black Card. And they call it a Centurion card now, but it used to be the black card, and there was a separate black card before that. Number one, the annual fee for that is $2,500 a year, and the initiation fee is $7,500. There are rumors that people literally went out and bought multi-engine jet aircraft with these Amex black cards, and they went through, no problems. There were rumors that literally on the black card, you will never be turned down for anything you try to buy. These are people that are wealthy and that have the means to do anything they want. I don't fall into that category, and I'm not really jealous of it either. The fact is, I don't care when you get to heaven if you have an Amex Black Card and you're a Chase private client and you're rich and you're beautiful and you look like you just came out of a commercial. You're in the same boat as I am when it comes to sitting before God. That doesn't give you any advantages. If anything, it might actually give you a little disadvantage because you might think you're better than everybody else. We get into that category sometimes. God doesn't care. Not once has God ever says, wow, look at that portfolio, I'm letting him in. Ain't going to happen. In addition to that, we're all under sin. There's nobody that doesn't have a sin nature. There's no one that can say, I never sinned. God's impartial. We're all in the same boat before God. Now, what things can we learn from all of this? One of the things is God is just and impartial. And in order to be just and impartial, we have to depend on the fact that God is holy because his justice and righteousness flow from his holiness. But let me bring up another thing maybe we haven't thought about. God is just and impartial and doesn't need to justify himself. But what that also means is frequently our reality may not match his reality. Very easy for us to see things very differently from God. And if I'm saying something different from God, I think we can all figure out who's wrong there. The fact is, we may not match in realities. One of the things I will never forget is Linda and I took a wonderful trip 6 or 7 years ago. And we visited Zion National Park in Utah, Bryce Canyon, Monument Valley, Arches, Natural Bridges, Grand Canyon in Arizona, etc. Okay? Incredible trip. I will never forget what happened at Monument Valley. We had a hotel, it actually is the only one at the time, that actually sits right on the valley. And you have a balcony that looks, second-story balcony that looks straight out at the monument. If you've never been to Monument Valley, It's a wonderful place. If you don't know what I'm talking about, as soon as you see it on the internet, you'll go, oh yeah, I've seen this in movies, okay? But here's the thing. I came back. I went out to grab something for dinner. Linda wasn't feeling that great, so I went out and grabbed something for dinner and came back. And I looked at Linda, and what I saw was a look of horror on her face. And she didn't have to say anything, but I looked at her and said, what happened? And she pointed over at the counter. She had just brushed her teeth. Unfortunately, it's amazing how much a toothpaste tube and a tube of Bengay look alike. Yeah. The fact is, her reality did not match the reality of what was in that tube, and when she put it in her mouth and brushed her teeth quickly with it, it didn't take long to realize a deep heating rub is not toothpaste. And even after rinsing out her mouth many times, yeah, I know, that's what she was saying. Yeah, it was ugly. I haven't told me she was, obviously, but it was ugly, the situation. We laughed about it, but the point is, her reality didn't match reality. Our reality doesn't match God's a lot. Postmodernism is a great way about this. Postmodernism, you think about it, what are they saying? There is no absolute right and wrong. We run into that every day. People, well, it depends. No, it doesn't depend. There are some things that are right and there are some things that are wrong. There are some things in a Christian life that are wrong for one person and not another. I'll give you that. But there's certain things that are basic wrong and certain things that are basic right. Is there a God? Yes. Is God the God of the Bible? Did He send His Son to save our sins through His blood? Yes. Is there anybody else who can do the job? No. Postmodernism would disagree. Their reality doesn't match God's reality, and I guarantee in the end it's God's reality that's going to win. Judgment Day comes, and the final judgment, God's reality wins over everybody. And even if you look now, our not believing in God or seeing Him differently doesn't change Him. Puts us in a bad spot, but it doesn't change Him. Now, the next question I've got is for application here is, what about those who have never heard? Every time you want to, not every time, you witness to somebody, yeah, but what if there's somebody in some island off the coast of Borneo who was a headhunter who never, yeah, I know, they had headhunters back in Borneo, I don't care. You know something? The first question I got to ask them is, okay, do you live on that island outside Borneo and have you heard? The very fact that you can formulate the question of what about those who have never heard implies that you have heard the gospel and you're hearing it right now. That question doesn't come up usually for sincere knowledge. That question comes up from non-believers because they want to find an excuse for not believing. To say God is not fair because He didn't share His gospel with everyone. Now, the fact is, I could go through the Bible, I believe, and prove that, yes, the gospel was shared because it was given to ancestors through natural revelation. In Romans chapter 1, we saw that in verses, 18 through 22, 18 through 21. The point is, I think God has presented Himself to everyone, but that's not why they're asking that question. They're asking that question to say God isn't really fair, and therefore I'm not responsible and don't have to make this decision. It's avoidance. It's not a true question most of the time. And it's the same thing that was happening in these chapters with Paul. The next question here is, what about judging? God is qualified to judge, period. Okay, God is right in His judgments. Yet we have throughout the Christian church often this thing, judge not lest ye be judged. I probably won't even tell you what I usually say to people when they say that. Well, usually something like, quote, not lest ye be ignorant. But anyway, the point being is, while that is a verse in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 7, it's taken grossly out of context. Do I mean that we should be going around to every person we meet, sinner, sinner, sinner? No, no, no. No, I don't mean that at all. But as believers, we are called upon to be salt and light in this world. And part of that is saying, you can choose to do what you want, but there is a right and a wrong. This week on Facebook, I usually don't, but on Facebook I answered someone who I saw a posting, and the posting had to do with the fact that there's only one spot in the Bible that condemns homosexuality, and they brought it up and they said not only that, but in the original Greek it doesn't even mean that. But there's a couple of problems. Number one, it was in the Old Testament, and I had to say to them, for scholarship purposes, the Old Testament wasn't written in Greek, it was written in Hebrew, so you got a problem there. Secondly, it's all through the Bible. Romans 1, for example. Secondly, I explained in the Greek what it actually said, which, believe it or not, is far more explicit than the English. But I also said to them, look, if someone wants to act in homosexual ways, that's up to them. I can't stop them. But don't change what God's Word says. At least be honest and look at it. I think that was, again, being salt and light, not trying to be confrontational about it, but be saying, look, there is a truth. If you choose to reject that truth, that's fine. That's up to you. And in truth, it wasn't because it was just for them. It was because they were posting it to everyone, trying to be scholarly on the issue. And I don't think there was one sentence in their entire argument that was actually scholarly or true. But I think we have a right to say this is wrong, but we don't have to be objectionable in how we say it. But judging? No, if we follow God, we should be able to judge certain things. And within the church, we are definitely called to judge certain things. Does that mean I would call us judgmental? No, that's different. But we have to be able to judge not only for us, but we have to be able to judge for ourselves. Is it right or wrong for me to do this? So judging a lot of times gets a bad rap. Another thing which isn't in your outline, but I want to mention briefly, we talked about it before, is a good outcome does not justify actions. Many people have probably heard about situation ethics. It was really, really big a number of years ago, and it still gets a lot of play. And we hear situation ethics, and most people think situation ethics means do what you want to do. That actually isn't what it means if you study it. Situation ethics was brought up to say, whatever is the most loving outcome is what should be followed. Therefore, if you can do something and it brings love and joy to people, do it. The fact is, that's wrong. The fact is, there are times when we have to do things which are not going to be happy things for everyone. And again, when they say loving, they really meant, what makes people happy. The fact is, there's still truth. Doesn't mean we have to be objectionable, but we have to bear the truth and bring out the truth. And situation ethics was a way to justify actions because they didn't line up with biblical principles. And situation ethics wasn't just something for outsiders. There's a lot of pastors preaching that. The final thing I want to say here is, are we better than others? I think Paul would answer this in the same way I will. No way. It's Christ's righteousness that's applied to our account that makes us righteous. It's nothing we've done. It's nothing we deserve. I'm not better than anybody. I'm not the most handsome. I'm not the smartest. I'm not the most whatever, the wealthiest or anything else. I'm not going to impress God with anything about me as far as me goes. I'm not better than anyone, but I'm saved. I'm saved because I have faith in Christ, that His blood has covered my sins, and because of that, His righteousness has been set into my account to cover me. That's what makes me righteous. Not my own actions, but Christ's righteousness applied to my account. And if people want to go another way, they're free to do that. But you're not getting to heaven any other way. Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. There's a reason He said that. It's unpopular to talk about, there's only one way. Something that's judgmental. But it's also biblical in this case. There is only one way to God, period, Jesus Christ. If there's anybody, again, whether it's here, whether it's on the web looking at it later, who haven't come to this decision, look, you've heard the gospel. It's time to say, am I going to believe in Christ or not? Faith alone, not works. The works come as a result of the relationship. But if you come to that point in time, please, talk to us, make the decision, don't let it go. And if you're on the web, phone the church. Find another Christian to talk to about this. But there's no way other than Jesus Christ and His blood to get to heaven. And we are not better than anyone else. We're just forgiven. And we're saved because of it. Let's go ahead and pray.